This is Relationscapes. We're mapping the stories and ideas that shape who we are and how we connect with each other to build a more just world. I'm journalist Blair Hodges, and we're joined in this episode by David Pakman. Staying up to date with the news is a huge part of David's job. He's one of the most popular progressive political pundits on the internet today, and he's spent years navigating the media landscape. But even he's not immune to the burnout that comes with nonstop news cycles, sometimes feeling overwhelmed by local and global crises. So in this episode, we're diving into his new book, The Echo Machine, to explore how digital media shapes our political discourse for better and worse. Pakman opens up about his own exasperation about modern politics, the importance of media literacy, and how we can stay engaged without losing ourselves in the chaos. And most important, Pakman shares his strategy to balance activism with realism, focusing on issues where we can make a difference. In this episode of Relationscapes, we're talking about our relationship to the news. David Pakman, welcome to Relationscapes.
Thank you.
Now, your book actually surprised me right from the get-go, and here's why. Because you've been doing this for a long time. Back in 2005, you started hosting a little radio show, Midweek Politics, and you grew from there. And 20 years later, you're almost at 3 million subscribers on YouTube. And your professional life has been all about talking about politics. So it was so funny to see the title of, right at the beginning, in the preface here, the introduction, Why I Hate Politics. So I thought, whoa, what's happening here? Right out of the gate, he's telling me he doesn't like politics. Tell me about that.
Well, it's sort of tongue in cheek. I mean, I think the point that I make in the introduction is that I hate what politics has become. And rather than figuring out, hey, we don't really need to have hunger anymore. We're more than wealthy enough as a country not to have hunger, but we still do. Let's figure it out. Instead of being able to focus on the big important issues, we are in some cases relegated to or pushed towards dealing with people who can't even acknowledge just what basic facts are about the world, or spending a lot of time on these contrived social issues that are used oftentimes to deliberately take attention away from some of the real big economic issues that I would like to be trying to solve. So it's sort of, I hate what it means to engage with the political system because it's been degraded so much, is really the kind of broader point that I try to make.
Yeah, and I think the question is, how much does the internet play into that? Because I think the internet has a really great democratizing effect. Like, you've been able to grow your platform through this amazing thing. Anybody could start a show. Whether they can grow an audience, that's another thing. But anyone can put their opinions on the internet. We're on social media, so we're some guy from high school's popping in on my Facebook wall to sound off on something I said about Gaza or whatever. Do you think that, on the whole, conversations that are happening on social media that you're witnessing, do you find it to be a fruitful place to have conversations about politics? Or do you think the internet has kind of contributed to some of the frustrations that you've had with how our political discourse works?
No, I mean, at some general level, the caliber of many of the conversations that are happening on social media is of extremely low quality. At the same time, like you mentioned, it's because of the existence of a lot of these platforms that I even am able to do what I do. So my view on that, it's really a technological theory question. I'm reminded of the book Technopoly by Neil Postman, where he says, any new technology, first of all, will be really difficult to resist. So, you think back to, let's not allow cars because it'll put the horse buggy drivers out of a job. It seems so silly to think that could have been a technology that was really resisted. I think it's the same thing with social media. I think it's the same thing with large language models like ChatGPT and others. These things just sort of like are happening. So then the question becomes, what can we do to harness the most good and limit the bad? And sometimes the answer is some amount of regulation. Sometimes the answer is education. I think that's certainly part of what's going on with social media, which is people who lack basic media literacy don't realize that they're spreading fake news, or they don't understand whether they're reading a primary source or a blog that rewrites articles and changes the sort of scope and point of a lot of those articles such that they are no longer resemble the original reporting. So I think it's kind of like an all of the above. There's a lot of really worthless conversation happening in social media, and I really don't engage in any. I don't tweet back and forth with people or get involved in art. I just do my show, right? So the way I try to get the most good and limit the bad is I do my show and I disseminate it on these platforms, and then I turn off the computer and go outside and try not
Touch
to
grass.
rage, in the 140 or 280 character back and forths.
You say that our fractured political system can also exact a really heavy personal toll on people who are trying to engage with it. And you kind of are hinting at this in your response there. I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you manage dealing with political stress, especially we're dealing with a lot of it right now, how it's spilling over into your personal life and how you try to be real about what's happening, but not let it take over your life.
Well, I think it's really important to start with, it's not great practice to kind of live in the news. And I know people who get so consumed with what's in the news that it becomes almost disabling. And as soon as I see them in person, they're exasperated to immediately talk about, did you see this or did you see that? And I can see that it really is taking a big personal toll and occupying a huge amount of mental space. And so at a top level, we want to balance being informed people about what's going on in the world with also living in our communities. It is true that a lot of the tragedies that are taking place globally, we are not going to be able to do anything about. I wish it were different. And it's not not sort of that we don't care. It's just we can't solve every problem everywhere. And so
we can also be maximally aware of it. So that's the tension to me, is like you feel even more helpless and more aware.
That's right. And to a degree, excessive news consumption can generate that sense of impotence, for lack of a better term, where, wow, all this stuff is happening and I can't do anything. So what I suggest to others, kind of almost at my own detriment, right, is like the content that I produce is really to do a couple of things. It's to tell you about the sorts of conversations that are happening in the political world and the political system, to provide hopefully some combination of a place to hang out with like-minded people, a little bit of lighthearted relief, not taking ourselves too seriously, and hopefully a catalyst to go and say, all right, of all the different things that are going on, here's the 2 or 3 I really care about. Here's how I'm going to get involved. But it's also true that we can have an outsized impact in our immediate communities. It's not part of my show because I do a national show for a generalist audience. So if it's about what's happening in Milwaukee only, the show kind of loses its point. But I see what I do as open the door, enter this space, but don't live in the news. Really try to live in your immediate community is my suggestion. And personally, when I'm done producing my last show of the week, I don't pay attention to anything in news and politics until planning my Monday show.
Yeah.
That's critical for mental health.
Do you have conversations at home? I think your kids are pretty young, right?
My daughters too.
Okay, so not a lot of political talk around the table. I know you've made some kids' books though, right? Like you wanted to put some stuff out there that maybe parents could engage with their kids with.
Yeah, we did sort of like with my team, just a test run of 3 children's books on critical thinking, on voting, on the scientific method. My like real book is, what we're talking about here, and it's my first nonfiction book. But the idea was, I talk so often about the dearth of critical thinking and media literacy. Is there anything I can do to start some of these conversations in homes? And so it was a really interesting kind of test case, and they did very well.
Oh, good. Well, yeah. So The Echo Machine is the book we're talking about right now. And I'll give people a little bit of an overview. You're giving us a look at how we got to where we are in the United States, especially from the civil rights era to the present. And you take us up through Reagan and Clinton and Bush and Obama and now Trump, and how the political landscape has shifted. And your book identifies kind of some of the main issues we're facing right now about how truth works today, how people think about truth, how we assess fact, and how the media landscape impacts that. And I think it offers a pretty hopeful framework for how we can make things better, which is an interesting approach. I think a lot of people are feeling a lot worried and cynical and beat down right now. And so what's it like putting this book out with this hopeful edge to it? Because, you were working on it before we knew the outcome of the election.
That's right. It was finished, in fact, before I think it was finished before even Kamala Harris replaced Biden as the nominee.
Oh, wow.
So there were a lot of things we didn't know. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things that I really want to accomplish with the book. One is there is an audience of people that just don't consume this sort of material audio-visually. They prefer to read. And so I want something for those people to also have like an entryway into the work that I do and the kind of ideas that I support and hopefully defend in the book. The second thing is to give a little bit of an overview of the one main point is Trump is the kind of conclusion or outcome of 70 years of things that happened in the United States. And understanding that, I think, is useful both ideologically and emotionally for people who are struggling with what's going on. I want to make the point or kind of expose that there are countries that in their own ways have solved to a degree some of the problems that we're dealing with today. So like it can.
This is one of my favorite part of your book is you're talking about like Scandinavian countries.
Yes.
Americans are so American centric, and you're
That's
like,
right.
let's check out what's going on over here.
Yeah, and we look at South America, we look at India, Germany, and other places. And then finally, really push the idea that it's really hard to solve this stuff when our uncles and aunts are already reposting conspiracy articles to Facebook. Like, yes, we can talk to them about distinguishing fact from fiction and fake news sites and this sort of thing, but the ship has kind of sailed. And so really we need to be going back to educating kids starting pretty early about media literacy and critical thinking as a way to stop the problem informationally that we're having.
Yeah, let's talk about media then. You really lay it out nicely for us. You talk about how when newspapers and network TV news kind of ruled the media world, we had actual human editors who could make judgment calls about what would appear on the front page, what the top story was. They could choose stories that sold newspapers, of course. They wanted to sell papers, but they could also make some choices to educate the public, stories about for the public good. So to me, it was sort of like they could offer us like a bag of candy, but also a plate of vegetables. And that's what we had in front of us. Now it seems like with so many different media options, we can eat a diet of candy all day long. We don't have to go to any vegetables. And we're letting the algorithms do the work. And you point out how this can become a problem when algorithms are geared to keep our eyes on the screen. And they find that like being angry, being outraged, seeing simplified narratives, being presented with conspiracies, has been more likely to keep eyeballs attached. And so there are these perverse incentives now that we don't have these gatekeeping media figures. There was problems with gatekeepers too. I'm not saying it was like a perfect paradise, but I think that shift has really caused a lot of problems. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of it goes back to the idea of the good and the bad about any technology that Neil Postman wrote about. It also kind of gets back to Plato's concerns with democracy, which is that democracy is great, and also it leads to potentially the least competent people directing society, directing politics, etc. And one of the things that's unfortunately true is that the most kind of emotionally compelling content tends to be shared the most, regardless of its accuracy or its saliency in terms of what we are able to do. So the algorithm-driven process, I'm both a beneficiary of it and a victim of it as a news consumer like everybody else. It's really a double-edged sword.
Do you ever feel, I mean, sometimes you have to play into it, right? Like you, on YouTube, for example, you have the thumbnails that are sometimes you have to have like the goofy frozen, like the reaction and you have to title it like, oh, like give it a title that's going to grab people. As you're putting those together, does it ever feel like you have to play into the algorithm more than you like? Do you just see it kind of as the game you have to play? How do you feel about it when you see like the thumbnails and the eyeball grabbing headlines?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I've had moments where different people have called me out on my show for participating in the clickbait, and it's sort of like, yes, that's true. I admit readily that we select video titles, episode titles, and thumbnails to garner the largest possible audience. That's true. If I'm producing an hour a day, I want as many people as possible to watch that. And so could I title an interview with a member of Congress, Massachusetts congressman explains pros and cons of salt cap limit? I could title it that. It would get no views. Yeah. And my view is, if I've gone through all of the work of preparing for recording and having my team publish an interview, do I want to pick a title that is more in line with what attracts attention, that's maybe, congressman issues brutal warning on tax cuts. That will get more views. I don't think it's inaccurate, right? I'm not going to lie and say, congressman taken out on stretcher during interview if that didn't happen, right? I'm not going to do that. But yeah, I'm working within a system to try to figure out, let's get the maximum attention possible to content that fundamentally I feel good about, right? I'm getting my opinion out, and I think we're better off for having this content.
We're talking with David Pakman about his new book, The Echo Machine, How Right-Wing Extremism Created a Post-Truth America. Okay, I wanted you to talk about the food pyramid analogy. I really liked this. You're trying to get people thinking about media literacy, and you use the analogy of the food pyramid.
Yeah, and I put myself at the top with the junk food to just be totally upfront here. It's sort of like the idea of an informational pyramid. And there are lots of people who right now just consume opinion content like what I produce. It might be content that's on my side of the political aisle or the other, or a combination of the two. Doesn't really matter. I really consider that for experienced consumers of media, because otherwise you can fall into a lot of traps and believe a lot of things that aren't necessarily true if you're not able to distinguish between news and opinion programming, understand some history, some economics, et cetera. So in the book, I just sort of talk about really the base of this pyramid is epistemology, critical thinking. How do we know what we know? Understanding what is a proposition? Do conclusions follow from premises? This kind of basic thinking, these basic thinking concepts are at the bottom of the pyramid. We then want to have some subject matter knowledge in what we're talking about. So some understanding of history, some understanding of philosophy, some understanding in general about economics, so that when we hear elected officials talk about this type of tax cut or that type of tariff, we have an understanding both historically and economically as to sort of like what that means. Media literacy is another aspect to this, which is just because something says live in the corner and there's a logo spinning doesn't tell us whether we're watching an opinion editorial or a piece of news reporting. And so the media literacy skills are important. Then I suggest for most of our informational gathering about what's going on in the world, you really want to be hearing from reporting sources, Associated Press, Reuters, primary sources that are kind of on the ground doing the reporting. And then once you have all that, watch some opinion shows like mine, but that really shouldn't be the bulk of forming our understanding about the world.
Yeah, and that's my fear is I feel like that's where so many of the views are, right? I love the pyramid that you set up, and I think the kind of content you make needs to be made. I also wonder how to get more people kind of going further down to the bottom of that pyramid. And you're writing a book as part of your effort to help that happen. What do you suggest people do who sometimes it is easy to just throw on the video and listen to it, or throw on your podcast and listen to it, and maybe people feel like they're doing enough if they're doing that?
I mean, there's the micro and there's the macro. The micro would be when you're folding laundry and maybe drawn to have TikTok going, maybe it's an audio book with some subject matter expert that explains to you either history or philosophy or economics, right? So that's like a micro tactic, but it's really more about the macro, which is creating a culture of reading. And I don't think many schools do a great job of this. I mean, the way that I was taught most of the material in like English class and really most classes growing up, I didn't like it. The texts that were chosen were either the inappropriate ones or they were taught in a way that wasn't engaging. And students start to kind of like reject this. Oh, when I'm handed a book and told to read it, it's a bad experience. Obviously, since then, that's completely changed. And, this is just like a fraction of my books here. This is A through C right here that you can see. So I think that there needs to be a kind of cultural change. And with really little kids, we do a pretty good job. Most parents know that with a baby, a 1-year-old, 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, you read every day.
Yeah.
And it gets kind of lost. And a lot of times the kind of default path of school does it in a way that turns students off. But I think we kind of have to restructure that culture so that being informed about a lot of the things I talk about at the bottom of the pyramid is revered rather than sort of seen as what you do if you don't really want to have fun.
Yeah, this is where I think about the commentariat, and I think you're sort of part of this. I don't use that as an insult. I mean, like the kind of punditry, the kind of talking head type of dissemination of news. And I think so many people can't distinguish between that and an expert in a particular subject area. And, you do a good job of this. You bring on experts, you bring on people and you interview them and you talk to them. So you're platforming people who have greater expertise, and you're kind of serving as the standing in for the audience, asking them questions and letting that talk. But I think a lot of people aren't distinguishing enough between punditry and an expert witness. And this is where style can just beat the crap out of substance.
That's true, but we also can't ignore that now for years we have had a political class that loves to say they know better than the experts, right? I mean, we've started to think back to Trump's first term, where he knew better than the doctors and the epidemiologists and the generals and the engineers and the economists and the teachers.
Well, injecting bleach was a successful, I don't know if you tried it, but I found it to be very good. So
it worked for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when there's a talk about the crisis of expertise we sometimes hear about, which is that just because you call yourself an expert doesn't mean that you are, which is true, but that's been taken too far to where there are people who believe my opinion about anything is just as valid as someone who is truly an expert, and that's a real problem.
Yeah, you trace in the book how the GOP has really leaned on this kind of personal opinion is equal to, like, everybody has a right to have their opinion, which somehow gets transmogrified into everybody's opinion is just as good as anybody else's opinion.
And what's fascinating about that is that there is a framework of postmodernism in that idea.
Yeah.
Which the right...
Let me define that for you real quick. It's this idea that, like, knowledge is sort of personally interpreted and we're all situated someplace. And so when you're talking about postmodernism, you're sort of talking about this, the relativity of how we can understand truth. And that can either mean that all truth is relative or a recognition of our limitations and that we can only relatively know the truth. In other words, we're seeing it from our own perspective, right?
Certainly. And I think that this is also kind of inextricably linked to the concept of identity politics, which on the one hand, I've been critical of when the political left uses identity to silence. I very much disagree with using identity sort of like as a cudgel to say you don't get to voice an opinion based on your identity, which I'm very much against. At the same time, when the right says identity kind of doesn't matter at all, it is true that identity gives us perspective that others may not have. For example, as a Jewish person myself, there are opinions I have which are informed by my dealing with anti-Semitism that a non-Jewish person could understand but would not have the same perspective as I do. So that's valuable. I don't want to use that to shut anybody up. It doesn't mean only I get to speak, but we do want to recognize when identity does provide a useful perspective and listen to those voices. So with a lot of these concepts, it's not just yes, no, good, bad, black, white. We're talking really mostly in shades of gray.
Yeah. I want to ask you about platforming extremists. You take some time in the book to kind of argue about whether it's okay to invite someone on a show on a prominent platform that has some really extreme ideas, the downsides to that and the upsides to that. You kind of try to make a case for why sometimes you think it's a good idea to engage.
Yeah, I don't think there's any hard and fast rules of like, okay, homophobes allowed, Nazis not allowed, or, I don't think that it's this simple, right? And so the way
Nazis, maybe.
The way I kind of talk about it in the book is if there are ideas that are growing in prominence such that if we don't fight them, they may actually start to convince people in the general public. And if I feel as though I'm equipped to rebut those ideas, then I think it's a worthwhile endeavor. And I gave the example of the Westboro Baptist Church in the book. Mm-hmm. Some of your listeners may not even know who I'm talking about. The Westboro Baptist Church is a church of technically of sorts that was quite prominent 15 years ago. And what they were most known for was showing up and holding homophobic signs at the funerals of military service members, at the funerals of people they believed to be LGBT, whether they were or weren't. That was kind of their big thing. At the time, they were prominent enough and causing enough disruption that I thought it was a reasonable thing to bring people on from the family, mostly like a family church with some ancillary hangers on. I thought it was worth bringing some of these folks on, exposing them as hateful, and hopefully doing my part to push back against these ideas. Today, they've essentially disappeared from the sort of public sphere. Gay marriage is now legal, which it wasn't at the time. Doesn't mean LGBT discrimination has ended, but there have been some advancements. At this point, it seems like it would just be kind of an exercise in titillation and nothing else. So I wouldn't have them on today. 15 years ago, I thought it was a worthwhile endeavor.
So don't do it for the clicks. How do you try to carry yourself in that interview? Like, what are your concerns? If I'm going to do this, here's what I need to do on my side of things.
I want to make sure that I'm anticipating their arguments such that either I give them enough rope to hang themselves with, or I can provide substantive pushback to make it clear, not only do I not agree with these ideas, they're bad ideas, and people should come away hopefully on the side of these are bad ideas rather than convinced by those ideas. And then from a sort of like emotional standpoint, I don't want to get reactive and start yelling or become overly emotional, because I think that really doesn't translate well.
Yeah, you're trying to think of your audience and how they might perceive it and say, well, I don't know, that guy looks unhinged. He looks really angry, and might misconstrue that as having lost the debate or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, you talk about trying to maintain emotional composure, being well prepared, and not just letting people come on and get away, just give their talking points if you already know they're problematic. And I mean, I thought of the Gavin Newsom interview. I was disappointed with seeing him in Charlie Kirk, where I thought there wasn't a lot of pushback there. He found like common ground with someone, didn't really dig into many disagreements, and let some pretty toxic ideas about trans folks be shared on the show. So I kind of contrast that with other people, that if you're gonna do that, I just think you have to be so well prepared. You brought me around a little bit more. I used to be much more on the side of like, don't even bother. Just bring on experts, just talk about what they're up to, and we can do it that way. But I do think where you got me was the idea that some of the people who are convinced by someone like a Jordan Peterson might watch your interview. If you interviewed Jordan Peterson, they might watch that. They might watch you on Joe Rogan, and you're able to show some different ideas, and depending on how you carry yourself. So you brought me around a little bit on that. And your nuance too. I love this quote. You said, sunlight's the best disinfectant. So sometimes letting them come and share their views is enough. People say, oh, that's terrible. Like you said, give them enough rope, they'll hang themselves. You say sunlight's the best disinfectant, but sometimes sunlight can also cause weeds to grow. And so I appreciated it was a pretty nuanced approach. And you, like I say, you kind of swayed me a little bit more away from like, don't platform people at all.
Yeah, and I think my views on this, where I would draw the line, has also changed over time. And I think that that's just naturally a part of growing as a person who does public commentary. And I wouldn't necessarily draw the line. I think, listen, there are probably some interviews I did 12 years ago that I just wouldn't do now, even if everything was exactly the same, because I would kind of characterize the balance a little differently. But I also would say that as a person who is now 12 years older, so you're never exactly in the position of making the same decision again. But certainly there are probably a handful of interviews where it was like, I could have kind of taken it or left it.
All right, well, let's close by talking a little bit about the contrast you make between hobbyism, political hobbyism, and political activism. And I want to close here because a lot of people are feeling kind of frozen right now. There's so much going on every day, so much in the news, so many things happening that we don't like. And it can be really easy to just either completely disconnect or just freak out so bad. So you talk about hobbyism and political activism, and I think this is a really healthy way for us in this particular moment to think about how we're politically engaging.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you watch or listen to a show like mine or read my book and you vote and maybe you sign a petition here or there, you're doing the minimum, and that's great. But really the point of voting so you have a stake, following the opinions of people that maybe are sort of politically in your wheelhouse. This is really hopefully to get you to figure out, okay, given that I can't solve every problem, I can't work on everything, I may not be able to fix the situation in China with the Uyghurs and the Ukraine war and also poverty in favelas in Brazil, right? You can't fix everything. Here's a couple of things that I do want to get involved in. I'm going to learn more about those things, and then I'm going to participate either in organizing rallies in my community or lobbying for an ordinance to be changed in my state or in my city. Or I think that the idea here is it's good to have something beyond just kind of being a passive observer if you really want to feel that you are involved in a substantive way. Now, in the book, I talk about big ideas for activism: mass rallies in urban centers, strategic debt defaults, coordinated absences from work. I mean, like big things that have worked over history. Doesn't mean everybody's going to do those things, but the idea is just to be thinking of the gap between I listen to some shows and I'm going to get involved and try to achieve change. This doesn't mean everybody is able to do it. Doesn't mean you need to feel bad if you can't. But the idea is creating two concepts of activism and political hobbyism so that people can really understand and say, where do I want to be on this spectrum, if that makes sense?
Yeah. People can learn more about that in the book. It's called The Echo Machine, How Right-Wing Extremism Created a Post-Truth America. David Pakman, he's host of The David Pakman Show, which you can check out on YouTube. David, thanks for talking with me about the book. I really enjoyed it a lot.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
So many more questions, so little time. Thanks to David Pakman for joining me, and also thanks to Beacon Press for setting our discussion up. And thank you for checking out this episode of Relationscapes, where we map out the stories and ideas that shape who we are and how we connect with each other to build a more just world. And if this is your first time joining us, I invite you to check out the audio podcast wherever you get your podcasts. You can look it up. It's called Relationscapes. I've had some truly incredible guests, including national best-selling authors and award-winning researchers who are tackling everything from the evolution of the human body to the invention of the family to the future of love in the digital age and more. So if you're curious about how relationships shape you and how you shape relationships, you'll find plenty to explore on Relationscapes.